Hello and welcome to my talk, Google Maps Not Greyboxes, Digital Location Scouting for Untitled Goose Game. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm recording on, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. My name's Jake Strasser, and I'm a member of House, we're a small video game company from Melbourne, Australia. In September of 2019, we released an untitled game about a goose, which I couldn't have done without the help and hard work of these people. Halberstadt did the sound design. Colonica helped us refine the game's look very early on, then came back to fill the village with plants. Dan Golding made the music, and Cherie Davidson implemented a bunch of accessibility features. The game was published by Panic, with production help from Felix Kramer and Nick Sutner. We were funded in part by Film Victoria, and 22nd Century Toys helped port the game to consoles. They're all wonderful people to work with, and I wouldn't be here giving this talk without their help. House is myself, Nico Disseldorp, Stuart Gillespie Cook, and Michael McMaster. Before we started making our first game, Push Me Pull You, 7 years ago, none of us had any experience making video games. I was fresh out of film school, Michael and Stuart studied fine art, and Nico spent the previous year teaching himself to program by making psychedelic math toys. We're all self-taught, multidisciplinary game developers. We work by consensus and make design decisions together by talking and arguing until we find that consensus. It's a slow, messy, inefficient way to work, but it's very fulfilling, both because it's lots of fun to have lots of conversations with your friends all the time, and because it produces work that we can be collectively proud of, because we all agreed on it every step of the way. My level design practice in the Goose Game emerged from this collaborative, reactive, iterative setting. In September of 2017, this is what the Goose Game looked like. We'd been working on it part-time for a year or so, working in that collaborative, reactive, iterative way to build it from the bottom up, starting with the goose and just kind of snowballing out from there. So we made the goose, we made a person, we made some stuff that person cared about, and explored the kinds of systems and environments that made it fun to steal that stuff, and built things up step by step. From a level design standpoint, I've been working in a pretty instinctive way up to that point, drawing on the BBC kids shows that we grew up on, and basing a lot of the garden on my grandparents' backyard, where I spent a lot of time helping out as a kid. My priority up at that point had just been to kind of jam as many different playful dynamics into the level as I could. Goose was the first 3D game any of us had made, so I was learning how to use Blender and Unity at the time, and was exploring what I could do with the tools that I had. For example, each garden bed does something different, so it ended up feeling a bit like a playground. There's the high planters you can hide behind, the potato plant you can hide inside of, the pile of dirt that lets you get up high, and a bunch of different plants and vegetables that you can interact with in different ways. We were just exploring all the different things we could do with this game, so questions about stuff like setting and context were kind of secondary at this point. That was about to change though. In October of 2017, we released the first public video of the game, showing off this level, and people got very excited about it. Up until that point, we thought we were working on a bit of an in-joke with very niche appeal. We were honestly preparing to package up this one level and put it on itch.io for free, before moving on to some other more kind of serious project. But the response made us realise that maybe we were onto something. And so soon after that, we got funding from our state government, thank you Film Victoria, and Cable from Panic sent us an email, and before we knew it, we had a publisher, a budget, and the opportunity to work full-time on the Goose Game. And so now we had to start thinking seriously about the game as a larger finished thing. I had this vague pastoral British setting that had come together in a kind of automatic way, but it seemed apparent that working off of TV shows and memories of Australian suburbia wasn't really going to cut it for the kind of game world that we wanted to end up with. Don't get me wrong, shows like Brum, Postman Pat, Fireman Sam and Wallace and Gromit were incredibly valuable starting points. They influenced all sorts of things like characters, settings, the materiality of stuff, even the comedy. The Goose Game is a response to these shows in a lot of ways, but they were just a starting point. And if we're going to make a game set in the UK, I wanted to be very careful about the way that I represented it. I felt a real responsibility to ground our chosen setting in the real world and do it with a sense of specificity, authenticity, and nuance. But there was one kind of major problem standing between me and the authentically captured British village video game level of my dreams. I don't live in the UK, I've never lived in the UK, and I've never even been to the UK. So I had to find some other way to try and absorb, process, and then authentically represent the, Britishness, the geographical, spatial, material, historical ticks of a place I'd never experienced firsthand. We showed the other level to some friends from the UK and asked for feedback on whether it felt authentic or not. And one of the things they flagged was this chain link fence. Now I know that chain link fence is a thing that exists in the UK. I've seen photos of it. There are UK businesses with .co.uk web addresses that sell it. And I'm sure there must be a garden like this somewhere in the UK that has a chain link fence just like this one. But our friends said it was just wrong. It felt wrong. You wouldn't see a fence like that in a garden like that. This was the kind of thing I felt I had to be very careful of. And if I could get something as seemingly obvious as a chain link fence wrong, I wondered how I was going to go authentically capturing stuff that's even harder to put your finger on. What are the accumulative set of details and nuance that make a village feel British? I didn't really know, and I certainly couldn't put it into words now, but I wanted to get as close as I could to capturing whatever it was in our game. So back in late 2017, we were piecing together an outline of what a finished version of the Goose Game might look like. On top of the garden level we'd already made, we envisioned 3 more self-contained levels. A shops level with a very protective shopkeep and a wimpy kid. A set of backyards with 2 neighbours you could play off each other. A level in a pub that felt a bit like a fortress that you had to infiltrate. And some kind of finale to give the game a resolution, although we weren't quite sure what that would be yet. We also knew that we wanted to have all these areas fit together in contiguous space. Even though the challenges in each area would initially be self-contained, we wanted to eventually allow free travel between them as the player progressed, through what we like to call Dark Souls doors.
A gate, locked from one side, that when opened allows travel between 2 areas that had at first seemed geographically isolated from one another.
Thank you. So I had this nested task ahead of me, of designing these levels that had their own discrete gameplay dynamics, logic and setting, while knowing I eventually had to situate all these things in a whole. And I wanted it all to feel authentically British, whatever that meant. So when it came to actually start building the levels, in order to imbue them with some kind of spatial authenticity from the very start, instead of beginning my levels with a grey box layout, I did what felt natural as a filmmaker and went location scouting for real-world locations that fit the need of our design goals. When you're making a film and need a location, unless you have heaps of money to design and build a set, you go out location scouting and find a place in the real world that fits the requirements of the script. And since I couldn't just pop over to the UK to go location scouting, I did the next best thing and jumped onto Google Maps and Street View and started looking around. I started out just by first trawling around different villages from all around the UK, looking at how things fit together, how waterways, parks, churches, shops and houses interacted with one another, how different landscapes, available building materials or economic histories helped shape them. I was particularly interested in looking at how the stuff I already had, a body of water, a green, and a semi-public garden, probably owned by a church or council, fit into real villages. I took a pretty scattershot approach to my research and just kind of drifted around the internet, slowly building a list of villages that I could imagine the Goose Game being set. I was hoping to build up a kind of spatial literacy for villages and also find specific locations to act as a source for my levels. And I did this because I didn't really trust myself to design with Greyboxes. I thought if I was working in that totally abstracted way, where the spatial application of game design overrides everything else, it would be even harder to tell if I was doing things wrong. Like designing the spatial equivalent of a chain link fence. I thought if I chose a source location I could return to whenever I needed, that matched the level I wanted to design as closely as possible, I'd have this external thing that I could check my work against, and that it might keep me more honest as I built out the level. As I see it, my level design practice on the Goose Game was all about maintaining that dialogue between a source location and the level as it developed. It's about maintaining a constant back and forth between the disciplines of research, game design, and environment art, allowing the affordances and requirements of the source locations, gameplay, and aesthetic restrictions to feed back and inform one another in all directions as the level comes together. Let me illustrate this with the story of how we're designing and building the shops level. Broadly, from a research perspective, I knew I wanted some shops in a village setting. That meant location scouting for a small, privately run general store in a more commercial part of the village. Our art style was starting to feel broadly pretty established, but moving from a more green, pastoral setting into something more urban presented new challenges. We still weren't really sure what buildings should look like in our game, or whether like a big expanse of grey concrete would look any good. And a restriction of our game is that everything has to happen outside, or at least be visible from outside, so all the shop stuff needed to be out on the street. We're also interested in having the level be this kind of interplay between a very dense, restricted area where all the stuff is, and then quite open, empty space around it. So as you play through the level, the dynamic would be sort of this, ducking in and out of this danger zone of the shop. I started out by letting our design goals for game design, direct my research, and went location scouting for commercial areas that had a Goose Game level's worth of space around them. Finching Field in Essex was an early favourite in my village shortlist. I'd come across it through image searching village green with pond, and it was beautiful, but it didn't have any shops that I could see working as a Goose Game level. These ones sit on quite a busy road and didn't have any room out the front for stuff to go, and for the goose to run around without feeling like you might get hit by a car. So on a whim, I went looking around some neighbouring villages and found, just a few miles away, Thaxted. It was historically more of a commercial hub in the region and has this lovely wide old market square in the middle of town with a medieval guild hall overlooking it all. Importantly, and unlike a lot of villages I'd looked at, it had this very deep footpath laid down when they ran a modern street through the old square. That created this very deep, open space between the road and shop fronts and allowed traders to put stuff out on the footpath. I thought this location might serve my purposes for the level, so I put together this sketch based on the shops in Thaxted. I realised pretty quickly early on that I needed to put this curve into the line of buildings to try and keep the play area focused around the central shops. And as I kept working on the level, I drew in a bunch of dressing from Thaxted. In Street View, in the same spot, I could cycle between different capture dates and find heaps of different ideas for props and dressing and level geometry. So here's 2009, and 2014, and 2015, and 2016. There's such a wealth of information in just this one spot, and a lot of stuff from Thaxted wound up in the finished game. From 2009, I got this fruit and veg stand, and these shelves. From 2014, these hand trucks and plants. And from 2016, these tubs and toilet paper stacks. And just next to those shops, this little scene offered the postbox, pump, rubbish bin, and bench. As I worked on the level, when I needed some kind of level geometry or dressing, I'd go back to the location and look for features that would suit my purpose, and could do it with confidence, knowing that they were all coming from the same place, so they'd all fit. After about a month working on the shops, this is what they looked like. We'd set ourselves a time limit of a month to do a first pass on each new level. And so with the shops looking like this, we moved on to the backyards, and after another month on them, the pub. We were trying to quickly feel out the full scope of the game and get a clear picture on the amount of work it would take to actually finish it. And so once we had roughly playable versions of each level, I laid them out as an interconnected village for the first time, to start to get a feel for the game as one big level, and just start processing in the back of my mind what the village on the whole might look and feel like. And now that I was thinking more holistically, when we looped back to the shops for a second pass, it started to become clear that maybe Thaxted wasn't the right location for the shops or for the village overall. The deep footpath, which had seemed like such a great discovery early on, combined with the density of the buildings, suggested a much larger urban town that I wanted to portray. Plus, Thaxted's pastel-painted houses looked weird and kind of immaterial in our art style. The footpath also failed to fulfill some of our game design requirements. The level needed to be enclosed by walls of some kind at the peripheries, which the location at Thaxted just didn't support. I tried curving the line of the buildings to focus play in the middle, but the play area felt too long and skinny, and it wasn't clear where the edges of the level were. So I went looking for other locations that could offer a solution to my level layout problem, and offer a more holistic direction for the village. I looked at pedestrianised options like this one in Helmsley, and I love the tiny village feel of Mortarhoe and its general store coming right onto the road. They were both very pretty villages, but neither really solved my layout requirements of depth and enclosure, which I realised was my main issue with Thaxted. They both felt very open at the peripheries, and long and skinny, like streets tend to be. So what I was looking for was something that felt like a street, but wasn't really long and skinny, and was enclosed by natural feeling boundaries. A street that wasn't really a street. And while I was mulling this over, I was also just working day to day on the dressing of the shop itself. In my folder of collected reference photos, I had this one, of the Orford General Store. At some point I visited the village in Street View, I think to get a better look at that awning, and eventually realised it presented a solution to my layout problem. So this is Pump Street in Orford, with the general store right in the middle. The space formed by the diagonal road and the right angle of these two buildings gave me enough enclosed space to keep the level contained, while still feeling like a street. It feels intimate in a small village way, and I like that the pump and the space left around it suggest a kind of historical function of the space that has since changed. I started spending more and more time looking around Orford, researching its history, and getting better acquainted with the village, and it started to feel like it would make a good source location for the game overall. It was a medieval port with a 12th century castle at the edge of town. I liked the modest Georgian architecture and the red brick that everything was built from. It's beautiful in an understated, functional way that feels recognisably British. So I reconfigured the shop's layout based on Pump Street. And it was immediately a big improvement over the Thaxted layout. As a level designer, I thought the flow through the level felt much better. The open areas around the shop felt more contained, and they funneled the player more in and out of the shop, which is what we wanted the level to do. As a researcher, the layout felt quite unconventional as a streetscape, which I think helped make it feel more specific and hopefully more authentic as a result. It stopped feeling like any old footpath with the long string of shops and houses, and started feeling more like a unique place with its own quirks and history. And as an environment artist, I was happy to be working on a level that didn't feel so long and flat, and being able to draw from a source location that felt more coherent and pleasing when rendered in our art style helped me move out of a sketchy, non-committal art and into resolved final assets much quicker than I expected. As I was working on the level and looking at Pump Street, I wasn't interested in faithfully recreating the location one-to-one. My priority was to make a good Goose Game level that was fun to play. So in the places where the Pump Street location didn't work for whatever reason, I go looking for around the rest of Orford for a solution. For example, these real buildings on the left side wall didn't work for the game. We needed an unbroken edge to the level, and I needed a spot for a phone booth. And just 50 metres away in real life is this hall, with the phone booth there on the left, and putting it in the level made it feel more like the centre of the village, rather than a back street. It's functionally just a big wall, so it felt like a good opportunity to dress it up with an interesting facade that helped contextualise the street. And when I went to fit the two shops into the space, I really liked the long terrace building that was already there, but needed two distinct shop fronts. And just next to that hall, very close by, in Orford, are these two shops, which first went into the level with their original black and white, but I repainted it at some point. I built this garage into the level early on, just because it was there in the location, and I liked that it gave it a bit of visual variation. It was just kind of a nondescript wall collider, really, and I didn't put much thought into it. But then much later, we were working on what we called the gating puzzles. They're one last task the Goose has to do in each level to open a gate and proceed to the next one. And we were trying to work out what the shop's gating puzzle could be. And I was thinking about how, since the shopkeep spends all her time chasing you out of the shops, it'd be nicely ironic if you could get her to chase you into a trap. and the garage was already there, ready to go. It was the perfect place to trap her. And it was the first gating puzzle we came up with, and was by far the easiest to implement, and the least contrived, because it was already built into the location. This was probably the clearest example of a source location directly informing or even directing our game design. The shops level ended up being a kind of collage of these bits of Orford, with some of the specific dressing sprinkled in from Thaxted. And the most important thing I got from putting the shops level together this way was a sense of direction for the village and an overall sense of direction for the village in the game. By committing to this one location for the shops level, it felt like things started to fall into place for all the other levels as we moved back through and refined them. The backyards were originally based on these houses in Thaxted, and the level started looking out like this, and looked like this by the end of our first pass. They were the most tightly designed and contrived spaces by far, and since they were private spaces, I felt I had more artistic license with the specifics, and worked more from reference than any specific location. But when it came time to situate them in the rest of the village, I drew on Orford's terraced housing, laneways, and a bunch of different fencing from around town, and ended up with this. And the pub was originally based on the Fox in Purton, and looked like this at the end of our first pass. This version left a lot to be desired, and I wanted to completely redesign the level, so I spent a lot of time looking around at different beer gardens and pubs all over the place. But do you know what was waiting for me in Orford? The Crown and Castle. We had a bunch of different design requirements that I needed to work into the space, like the decking, the staff-only area, and the guarded entrance. But the location helped inform the overall logic of the space, and especially the ways that it interfaced with the street and surrounding land. Once I committed to using it as a source location, what had been a real design struggle came together surprisingly easily. In hindsight, it's kind of outrageous how well it worked. It gave me a layout and character, and once I'd figured out how to work our level design requirements into the existing space, I was able to build out and dress the level incredibly quickly, because I had such a clear source material to work from. And there was one last major offering from Orford. We were working on the end of the game. There's a final level where the goose breaks into the model village, which is a miniaturized version of the village you just played through. So you retrace your steps as a Godzilla, and when we first sketched it out, ended up at a miniature church, which had a golden bell in its miniature belfry. The goose had to steal it, naturally, so you tear down the tower and make off with the bell. That was all well and good until we decided that maybe it was just a little bit on the nose to have the goose destroy a church, even if it was a miniature one, during the climax of the game. So we needed an alternative fun tower to pull down, and started to think about castles. And do you know what's right next to the pub in Orford? And right next to the pub in the Goose Game? It's the perfect Goose Game castle. Like the pub, it feels too good to be true that this one village would offer up all these locations that fit our needs so well. In this way, the world of the Goose Game is a collage of real-world places. By maintaining this dialogue between the level and source locations, I was able to create highly designed levels that supported the goal of our game design, while keeping them rooted in a real-world location that I hope brings a sense of place, history, and specificity to the work. I'd like to finish off now by talking briefly about why it was important to me to take this approach, and reiterate some of the valuable things that came out of it. So how come? Why does a silly comedy game about a goose need a research-focused approach to level design? My first were social concerns. In the same way that stereotypical representations of people can be dehumanizing, I think the same applies to representing the real-world places that people live. It was my hope that the people who played our game and saw themselves or their lives implicitly represented in it would feel comfortable with what they saw. We're also conscious and wary that idealized portrayals of rural village life can be pretty politically fraught and can dovetail with a conservative narrative about the world. I thought that by being as specific as possible in my representation, it might help a little to ground the game more in reality, rather than some idealized version of it. Secondly, were creative concerns. I think the grounded world of the Goose Game plays an important role in the humour of it. In the Goose Game, the people in the world act as a foil to the goose's comedy. We could more easily give the player control over comedic timing and bring them in on the joke, because the world they're presented with is grounded in a kind of mundane familiarity. This extends to the kind of objects and spaces in the game too. Familiar stuff, socks, a radio, gardening tools, and familiar places have all this inbuilt baggage in players' heads. Like if I hang a pair of socks on a clothesline, I don't have to do any extra work to signal that it would be naughty if you stole them and threw them in the pond. I don't have to explain that the socks are this person's favourite, or that she specifically hates it when a goose throws her stuff in a pond. Players just get it. So by keeping the world grounded in mundane familiarity, I think it helps players quickly engage with the game in a more confident, playful way, which was especially important with the Goose Game, because we needed players to feel confident enough to try and be funny. I also believe that just like players are able to instinctively intuit whether representations of a face or movement seem right or not, they also process levels and spaces in the same way. The Hotel in The Shining, by Stanley Kubrick, is infamously full of impossible architecture. Rooms don't properly fit together. It's full of doors and windows that shouldn't exist or lead nowhere. And Kubrick wasn't the kind of guy to do anything like this by mistake, so the film nerds think he must have intentionally made the architecture of the hotel itself feel uncanny. Now, I don't think an audience consciously knows why things feel a bit off, but I reckon their subconscious recognizes something's wrong. And I feel like it's easier for games to unintentionally end up with this spatial uncanniness. When levels get built in a void, in isolation from one another, I think aesthetic continuity can falsely supplant spatial continuity, and the kind of concrete geographical consistency that makes game worlds feel real on a subconscious level can get lost. And I think that players, whether they could consciously recognize it or not, pick up on that loss, and game worlds start to feel a bit like the Overlook Hotel, just a bit off. So it was important to me to take great care to ground my levels in a real place, making sure spaces are contiguous and maintaining a geographical logic and consistency to the world. And I hope that this would let the world of Untitled Goose Game feel richly concrete to players, in the small, mundane ways that real-world spaces do. The relative positions of spaces and the way they fit together become quietly remarkable and help create valuable moments of discovery and recognition for players as they traverse the space. And I think that basing my level designs on real locations rather than grey boxes helped me keep them grounded in the real world as they came along. I found it to be a flexible workflow where I could be more or less faithful to the location depending on the needs of our game design. I'd use the location to inform the general layout or logic to a space, and then I could then fill it with the required gameplay elements. And then I'd fill in any blanks by going back to the location to look for details or features, confident that they would be appropriate to the space. This was also quite an economical workflow. Although it took more time up front to get the right location, once I did, I could work really quickly, since the right location is so rich with valuable information. The pub level went from being rough as guts to near finished in no time once I'd settled on that location in Orford. Right through development, I found it really rewarding to just wander around in Street View, letting my subconscious absorb a whole heap of information. I think building up my literacy in this way made me a more confident designer, and better able to intuit whether my work was going in the right direction or not. This unfocused aspect, or kind of broad offering that a source location gives you, is really important, I think. Although I might have chosen a location for one reason, like the layout of Pump Street in Orford, a location brings with it all sorts of other hyper-specific information that has the opportunity to surprise you. I put the garage into the shops level because it was in a location and it was the perfect filler for an unused wall, and it ended up offering us a solution to a central game design problem. I found this approach immensely rewarding. There's an aspect of giving yourself over to a location when you work in this way, and trusting in it to offer up the things you need to put a level together. As a level designer and environment artist, I found that working in dialogue with a location like this meant that I could better focus on what the game needed and let the location offer up the rest. I'm really proud of my work on the Goose Game, and I hope this talk has offered a bit of insight into how it all came together. And I hope I'll get to visit Orford in person at some point soon. Thanks for listening. Bye.